They were just ordinary amateur horse races on a lazy summer afternoon in a sleepy little town. Nothing remarkable about them at all. No one there expected to witness the making of history. It all happened at the Crookstown Hill races. In the village of Bellistown, about 15 miles north of Dublin, Ireland, people still remember the day Barney Curley pulled off his legendary stunt back in 1975. The races in question took place on June 26, 1975. Barney Curley, our main character, if we can call him that, owned one of the horses scheduled to run later that day. But at the racetrack, while preparations were underway, Curley was nowhere to be seen. Not because he wasn't there, but because he was doing everything in his power to avoid being noticed. Had the bookmakers at the track caught wind that Curley was in Bellistown that day, or worse, that he owned one of the horses, they would have been on high alert and taken every precaution with the odds and wagers. Curley already had a reputation in racing circles. People knew he occasionally dabbled in betting schemes. And whenever he showed up at a race, it usually meant something fishy was brewing. But the plot he set in motion that day would turn out to be, without a doubt, the most daring one of his entire life. As the spectators placed their bets and settled along the edge of the track to enjoy a pleasant afternoon of racing, Curley was hiding in the thick gorse bushes near the center of the oval. It was hardly a comfortable spot, dusty, prickly, and overgrown. Yet there he stood, in his trademark felt hat, crouched behind the tall shrubs, binoculars pressed to his eyes. In the distance, the loudspeaker crackled to life. And they're off! Curley pulled his hat down over his bald head, as if to disappear under it, and peered through the lenses toward the thundering hooves. If everything went according to plan, the next 5 minutes would solve all of Barney Curley's financial troubles. But if the plan failed, if his horse faltered, or even the slightest thing went wrong, he would lose everything. His full name was Bernard Joseph Curley, but everyone simply called him Barney. He was born in 1939, one of 6 children of Kathleen and Charlie Curley in Northern Ireland. Even as a boy, Barney had a gambler's streak. It all started when his grandmother began slipping him 2 shillings to place bets at the local bookmaker's shop. She always told him to back her favorite jockey, Bill Rickerby. Betting at the time wasn't exactly legal, but it was one of those long-standing traditions everyone chose to ignore. Barney's father, Charlie, was a gambler too, though his passion for speed was focused not on horses but on greyhounds. The elder Curley bred and trained his own dogs, racing them on tracks all over Ireland. Among locals, he was known as Yellow Sam. Some said the nickname came from the color of his skin, but Barney suspected it had more to do with his father's shady habits. Old Sam had discovered a certain pill that could be given to a dog before a race to make it sluggish, a trick known in racing circles as stopping. He bred fast dogs, but whenever one of them started to draw attention or favorable odds, he'd slip the dog a stopping pill and quietly bet against it. For a while, the scheme was nearly as profitable as an honest living. Eventually, though, Yellow Sam bred a truly remarkable greyhound. In a 1955 race, the dog performed so well that it became the favorite for an upcoming event in Belfast. On race day, the stands were packed with thousands of spectators, many of them betting heavily on the prized hound. The gong sounded, the dogs were released, and the favorite stumbled. Sluggish and unsteady, it barely made it across the finish line, near the very back. It was a blatant case of tampering, and the crowd erupted in anger. Caught off guard by the uproar, Yellow Sam told his 15-year-old son, "Go fetch the dog." When Barney entered the race office, they told him curtly, "Send your father in." When he returned with the old man, the race official glared and said, "As long as you bear that name, you'll never race a dog here again." On another occasion, Yellow Sam handed young Barney a small piece of meat. He told him to take it to the kennels and feed it to a particular dog, the one that, coincidentally, was expected to run later that day. Knowing his father's dirty tricks, Barney took the package, went to the kennels, and fed the meat straight into the trash bin. Then he walked to the bookmakers and placed a bet on that very dog to win. That day, Barney Curley went home 12 pounds richer, roughly the equivalent of $500 today. Old Yellow Sam was furious when the drug failed to work. He stormed out of the house and confronted the pharmacist, shouting about a bad formula. Barney never told him the truth, that he had outsmarted his father. Bad luck and worse choices eventually caught up with Yellow Sam. Drowning in debt, he grew desperate. He had one greyhound left, a dog he'd been slowing for months, and decided it was time to let it run clean and bet big on its comeback. On race day, the dog burst ahead, fast and graceful, until it stumbled and crashed. Its spine snapped. Charlie Curley, tears in his eyes, walked the track to where the lifeless animal lay. "The party's over, Barney," he said quietly. "I've lost." In 1956, desperate to pay off the family's debts, Yellow Sam and 16-year-old Barney traveled to England to find work. They got jobs at a plastics factory in Urmston, an industrial town in the petrochemical belt. It took 18 months of grueling double shifts before they finally earned enough to get back on their feet. "It was strangely satisfying," Barney would later recall. "It made me realize how spoiled I'd been as a child." From then on, making money and living well became his life's mission. After returning home from England, Barney fell seriously ill and had to leave school. Doctors diagnosed him with tuberculosis. 9 months later, he was released, though it took 2 more years before he regained full health. Around that time, at just 22, he went completely bald. But it didn't seem to bother him. From that day on, Barney Curley wore his trademark felt hat everywhere he went. As a gift to himself for surviving tuberculosis, Barney Curley bought a gleaming new car, a Ford Zephyr. The payments turned out to be more than he could afford, so he came up with a side hustle. He went to a supermarket and bought a large supply of Gillette razor blades. The blades sold in Northern Ireland, where Curley lived, were both cheaper and of better quality than those available in the Republic of Ireland to the south. The Zephyr was a big car with roomy doors, and Barney discovered that by removing the inner door panels, he could stash a surprising number of razor blade packs inside the cavities. He was smart enough not to use the same border crossing too often, timing his trips to coincide with major events, like football matches, so he wouldn't attract suspicion. After a brief and superficial customs check, he'd drive across the border, pop off the door panels, and sell the blades to local shopkeepers for a handsome profit. He tried to boost his earnings further by visiting betting shops and wagering on horse races, but his results were mixed at best. At that stage of his gambling life, Curley was still what bettors call a punter, a man who places bets rather than takes them. So he decided to try the other side of the counter, becoming a bookmaker. The trade had recently been legalized, and using the money he'd earned from smuggling and gambling, he opened several betting shops and set up a stall alongside other small bookies at Celtic Park Racecourse. His pitch was located in an area ominously nicknamed the Killing Mile, so called because it was where bookmakers went to lose their shirts. After nearly 6 months of steady losses, Curley came to a clear conclusion. No one could be both a gambler and a bookmaker at the same time. It was a fool's game. He sold his shops and folded his pitch. Still, the experience had been invaluable. He'd learned the inner workings of the trade and, more importantly, discovered its many weak points. Those same weaknesses would later become the foundation for his perfect betting scam of 1975. Curley remained determined to make a living from betting. He still had friends and contacts in the bookmaking business. He also bought a pub, a place where drinks loosened tongues and gossip flowed freely. He became skilled at listening, at picking out the useful rumors buried in barroom chatter. He began placing larger bets at racetracks, winning just slightly more often than he lost. By the early 1970s, he was traveling regularly into the Republic of Ireland to bet on both horses and greyhounds. On one occasion, he left home with just £700 in his pocket and returned 3 days later with over £50,000. Between gambling and smuggling, it was a lucrative, if volatile, living. Then a new idea began to take shape, one that combined his love of betting with something tangible, owning and training racehorses. He purchased a stable and partnered with an experienced horse trainer named Liam Brennan. While Curley focused on acquiring new horses, Brennan prepared them for competition and prepared Curley for life. With his new breeding venture and his past experience as a bookmaker, Curley now had connections on both sides of the racing world. His information network grew sharper and wider, and he used it whenever he could. In racing slang, a win achieved through inside knowledge or deception is known as a coup. Despite alternating stretches of big wins and heavy losses, Curley developed a reputation as a man who flirted with shady betting coups, and bookmakers grew uneasy whenever they saw him arrive at a track wearing his trademark felt hat. If Barney Curley was around, people assumed something was up. By the summer of 1975, a series of bad calls had left Curley £30,000 in debt to the bookmakers, roughly $380,000 in today's money. It wasn't an extraordinary sum by his usual standards, but as he later put it, £30,000 is a lot of money when you haven't got it. His debts were nearly twice his net worth, and he knew that if he didn't settle them soon, the bookmaker's blacklist would end his career for good. He discussed the situation with trainer Liam Brennan. What they needed was an extraordinary horse, one that could dominate a race, but they knew none of theirs fit that description. That's when they began to hatch a plan for what would become the greatest betting sting in racing history. Together, Curley and Brennan studied the upcoming race calendar in meticulous detail, analyzing every factor: location, season, track surface, barriers, layout, facilities, and available jockeys. They cross-referenced this data with the performance records of dozens of horses, noting each one's strengths and weaknesses. Slowly, a plan began to take shape. A plan that would require a dozen trusted generals scattered across Ireland, each responsible for coordinating hundreds of small foot soldiers. In the end, the perfect opportunity emerged: a low-stakes amateur riders handicap race in the quiet village of Bellistown, a sleepy summer event that no one was paying much attention to. For the jockey, they hired Michael Furlong, a veteran amateur rider with the perfect name. And the horse at the center of it all? A completely unremarkable bay gelding. In the few races he'd ever run, he'd never finished better than 8th. To be honest, Curley would later recall, he was one of the worst horses I ever owned. The horse's name was Yellow Sam, and it was Yellow Sam whom Barney Curley entered into the Bellistown races. Back home in Wicklow, Curley secluded himself in his study. He began writing down the names of everyone in Ireland he thought he could trust. Paper maps hung across the walls, each name pinned to its location: Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Limerick. He became almost a hermit, sitting alone in his small office at Boswell's stud farm, surrounded by his maps and lists. Hour after hour, week after week, he pored over them, crossing out names he wasn't sure about, refining, filtering, until he knew he had the best possible team. It wasn't that he feared betrayal. He simply knew that too many people meant too great a risk of word getting out. He trimmed the list down to a dozen well-connected, trustworthy names. These were his generals. Curley emptied all his bank accounts, scraping together every last shilling. He called in old debts from friends and neighbors, and it said, even checked under the sofa cushions. Altogether, he raised £15,300. Then he met each of his generals in person, handed them an envelope of cash, and told them just what they needed to know. Find about 25 people you can trust. Give each of them between £50 and £300, a bit extra for their trouble, and tell them to be ready to walk into a bookmaker's office and place a bet on Wednesday, June 26th. And most important of all, never mention my name. A week and a half before the Bellistown races, Curley walked into the betting shop of a man named Sean Graham, one of the biggest and most powerful bookmakers in Ireland. Though the two were rivals in business, they shared a kind of mutual respect, even friendship. Still, Curley knew that if Graham got wind of what he was planning, the whole scheme would collapse before it began. "I've hit a wall, Sean," Curley told him. "I'm going to do something in about 10 days' time, and I need you to stay out of it. Give me your word you won't interfere." Graham looked at him and said, "Listen, if you touch one of my betting shops, I'll hang you myself." On a hot summer morning, June 26, 1975, Barney Curley climbed into his red Jaguar and began the 50-mile drive to Bellistown. Along the way, about an hour before the first race, he stopped at a phone box and called each of his generals. "The horse's name," he said, "is Yellow Sam. Go." Each man had his own list of contacts to call, who in turn called others, spreading the word to about 300 foot soldiers across Ireland. Their job was simple: walk into local bookmakers in the major towns, place small, inconspicuous bets on Yellow Sam, and never, ever walk into a Sean Graham's shop. Meanwhile, Curly drove to the home of a friend named Anne Brogan, who lived closer to Bellistown. He asked if she could drive him to the track in her car. He didn't want anyone to see his bright red Jaguar. She agreed, and as they approached the course, instead of joining the crowds, Curly asked her to take him to the far, rarely used side of the track. She parked discreetly, and the two of them slipped inside to watch the race unseen. The Bellistown course was a left-handed oval with 13 hurdles. In amateur steeplechases, jockeys often saw their horses for the first time only minutes before the start. When Yellow Sam's jockey, Michael Furlong, met his mount, his first impression was disappointment. The plain bay gelding wasn't muscular, heavy-bodied, yes, but not in a promising way. In racing, handicaps are used to level the field, lead weights added to each saddle, with the fastest horses carrying the most. Based on his past performances, Yellow Sam had been given an extremely light handicap. Curly's trainer, Liam Brennan, helped Furlong into the saddle. "Just don't drop too far behind," Brennan told him. Furlong was skeptical. Nothing about the horse suggested there was anything special in store that day. Curly and Brennan's plan to make a slow horse win a real race rested on 5 highly unlikely conditions coming together perfectly. First, in all of Yellow Sam's previous races, the conditions had worked against him. In hurdle races, most horses perform best on what's called soft ground, damp, springy turf that cushions each stride. But during training, Curly and Brennan had discovered something unusual. Yellow Sam ran far better over dry, firm ground. And in famously rainy Ireland, a rare dry spell had just begun. Second, many of Yellow Sam's earlier appearances had been at major racetracks against top-class competition. That contrast made him look slower than he really was. His best finish so far, 8th out of 17, had come in a strong field, on heavy ground, at a major meet. Third, his very light handicap would work to Curly's advantage when it came to betting odds, the multiplier that determines how much money a winning bet returns. If a horse went off at 4-1, a 10-pound bet would pay 40 pounds. The longer the odds, the bigger the payout. Based on Yellow Sam's poor record, Curly expected odds around 12-1. If the horse somehow won, he'd walk away with roughly 183,600 pounds. If not, if the horse faltered or fell, Barney Curley would be broke. Fourth, the Bellistown summer races were a modest, easygoing affair. Many people came simply for the air, the beer, and the company. The horses sent there were rarely top tier. The best thoroughbreds stayed home to rest. And fifth, Bellistown's racecourse sat far from civilization. It was used only occasionally, and the only working connection to the outside world was a single public phone box. Normally, bookmakers in the cities would call their colleagues at the track to report betting activity. Based on the incoming flow of bets, trackside bookmakers would adjust their odds, right up until the race began. To prevent that from happening, Curly added one final crucial step to his plan. He would cut them off from the outside world. If hundreds of calls started pouring in, warning that massive sums were being staked on Yellow Sam, the odds would collapse instantly. Curly's solution? Make sure those calls never got through. About half an hour before the race, a man named Benny O'Hanlon walked into that very same phone box. He picked up the receiver, dropped in a coin, and soon his voice was echoing through the glass. He was lamenting the condition of his dear, dying aunt. A small crowd began to gather outside. "Oh God," they heard him cry, "she's getting worse again." At first, the waiting bookmakers were sympathetic. 10 minutes passed, then 15. O'Hanlon kept feeding coins into the slot, his aunt swinging between life and death, recovery and relapse. The queue outside grew restless. Sympathy gave way to irritation. By the 20th minute, O'Hanlon was surrounded by an angry crowd, but he held his ground, still talking, still grieving. Without that phone line, the bookmakers at the course couldn't get updates from their city offices, couldn't adjust the odds, couldn't protect themselves from the flood of money coming in on Yellow Sam. Time ticked away. 25 minutes. The line remained busy. Across Ireland, bookmakers tried in vain to reach Bellistown, desperate to report the sudden surge of late bets on a seemingly mediocre horse named Yellow Sam. But all they got was a busy tone from that infamous phone box. At 3 o'clock sharp, over the loudspeaker at Bellistown, the commentator's voice rang out, and they're off. 9 horses burst from the starting line, hooves thundering like distant storm clouds. O'Hanlon quietly hung up the receiver, opened the phone box door, and walked away. Moments later, the phone began to ring. Curley and Brogan watched the race through binoculars from their hiding place among the gorse bushes. The commentator's voice was faint in the distance. Yellow Sam and Furlong were running mid-pack. After clearing a few fences, Furlong seemed to make up his mind. He urged the horse on, and Yellow Sam began to move ahead. As Curley thought about the 15,300 pounds he had staked on this moment, he might have remembered his childhood, when his father's greyhound stumbled just short of the finish line. Curley followed the first burst of speed through his binoculars, but as the pack thundered past his hiding spot, he realized a flaw in his plan to watch from the infield. Once the horses disappeared beyond him, he couldn't tell who was in front anymore. The stragglers and a cloud of dust blocked his view. Out on the track, amid the pounding hooves and the ragged breathing of horses, Furlong was astonished. Yellow Sam was flying. The horse leapt each hurdle cleanly, never breaking stride. Furlong pressed his advantage, and the veil of mediocrity fell away, revealing a capable, nimble jumper, unburdened by weight or wet ground. Clods of turf flew behind them as they gathered a speed that would have been respectable at any major meet. Yellow Sam didn't need to be a champion, only slightly better than the rest. And he was. At 5 minutes and 51 seconds, Curley and Brogan could see the race was over, but they couldn't make out who had won. They climbed into the car and drove toward the track entrance. In the stands, the crowd buzzed with disbelief. Yellow Sam had cleared the 13th and final fence 2.5 lengths ahead, to the amazement of spectators and bookmakers alike. He and jockey Michael Furlong had done it. The odds board still showed the original price, not 12-1 as Curley had hoped, but 20-1, nearly doubling his expected payout. As was tradition, Furlong trotted the winning horse toward the parade ring beside the course. But a ripple of confusion began to spread. Word had finally reached the towns, and people were realizing what had just happened. Anne Brogan drove Curley back to her house, where they shared a quiet cup of tea. She lent him £5 for petrol. He was flat broke until his winnings came through, and he drove home. That night, he slept like a baby. The next morning, Furlong saw his own photograph splashed across the front page of the Sporting Life. Biggest coup in Ireland, Yellow Sam at 20-1. That was how he learned he'd been part of Barney Curley's grand scheme. Some bookmakers initially refused to pay, but Curley hadn't broken any laws, and no single shop owed more than a few £1,000s. Grudgingly, they handed over the winnings, in large sacks stuffed with crumpled £1 notes. A friend advised Curley not to bring the money home. The stunt had made too many headlines. So he rented a hotel room, gathered his generals, and together they spent days flattening, sorting, and counting the bills. When the final tally came in, they had around £300,000, the equivalent of roughly $3.6 million today. Curley paid each of his generals about £1,200. To amateur jockey Michael Furlong, who wasn't allowed to receive direct cash payment, he handed the keys to a brand new white BMW. To his friend and former bookie employee, Benny O'Hanlon, for his one-man theater performance in the Bellistown phone box, an undisclosed envelope of cash. With the rest, Curley cleared his debts and still had plenty left over. Race officials increased Yellow Sam's handicap for future events, and bookmakers adjusted their odds accordingly. As details of Curley's feat spread through Ireland's racing and betting circles, the events of June 26, 1975 became legendary, known forever as the Yellow Sam Coup. Barney Curley became a folk hero, the man who beat the bookies at their own game. But it wasn't his last escapade. Years later, when moving house, Curley didn't sell his grand Georgian mansion. He raffled it off. Tickets sold so well that he earned several times the property's market value. Unfortunately, he hadn't secured a lottery license. He was arrested, then released on probation after donating £5,000 of his illicit proceeds to a local charity. Over the years, Curley was suspected of several other betting coups, though none ever matched the brilliance of Yellow Sam. In his later life, Curley turned toward philanthropy. In 1995, after the tragic death of his son in a car accident, he founded Direct Aid for Africa, DAFA, funding schools and hospitals in Zambia. He later recounted his extraordinary life, its wins, losses, and lessons, in an autobiography titled Giving a Little Back. On June 29, 2005, Bellistown hosted the Yellow Sam hurdle race, marking the 30th anniversary of the coup. Curley, then 65, attended with his old partner Liam Brennan, no longer hiding in the bushes, but sitting proudly among the crowd in his trademark felt hat. When their names were announced, the crowd rose to its feet and applauded, a warm salute to the men who pulled off the most famous betting coup in Irish history.